Mrs. Dow, said the curly-haired, highly recommended child psychologist as he sat in our kitchen. You have a problem. Your daughter is mentally handicapped. I smiled politely and complimented him on his briefcase, which was beautifully colored in ox blood and perfectly worn. Plenty of pockets for everything that you might need. My daughter, Annie, was 3 years and 4 months at a time, and still not speaking. My husband and I had ignored the warning signs for the past few years, putting it down to each child being unique. That was until my very frank and very wise friend Lulu couldn't contain herself any longer. "For God's sake, Sophie," she said. Well, actually, she was much more explicit than that. "Do something about it." And so I looked up something called a child psychologist in the Yellow Pages, something I didn't even know existed before that. And I asked such a person to come and take a look at Annie. The child psychologist in the kitchen had tested her practical abilities and her social skills for over 3 hours. Apparently, the two combined gives a reasonable picture to what the future holds. As the testing went on, I did my best to rationalize away the inevitable. I was never much good at skipping. I absolutely can't draw a mirror image of anything. And buttoning a shirt can be really complicated, and I'm sure I heard that Einstein didn't speak until he was 5 either. Maybe I should have given her more vitamin pills. Mentally exhausted, we say goodbye to the really very curly-haired expert on the front steps. "Thank you so much for coming. Have a nice day. Beautiful weather, isn't it? And where did you get that briefcase?" My name is Sophie Dow, and I'm really here by default, because the way I had planned my life, I was going to become head of the sports department at Swedish TV and hopefully move on upwards from there. However, I fell in love with a Scotsman in the early 80s and came to live in the UK. How to be okay in the future is the theme for today. And at first, you focus on the word future, something I used to think of in singular, my future, then my husband's and my future, then my husband's, his daughter, our sons and my future. And then Annie came along, and the word future took on a whole different meaning. And it was really the okay in how to be okay in the future that was to be my future, if you follow that. In fact, I have higher aspirations than just an okay for the future, but more about that later. So Annie is today 24 years old and mentally handicapped. In medical language, she's termed as having a mild mental handicap. But there's nothing mild about her handicap. It's fundamental to her, it's fundamental to us, and it has fundamentally changed our lives. At first, I thought a couple of sessions with an occupational therapist and a few more vitamin pills would do the trick. But as my research took me deeper into the, for me, then unknown world of learning difficulties, I realized that caring for Annie would be a full-time job. I also realized that there was very little collaboration between the various professionals and very little help and support for us families and parents. And that, I thought, had to change. The turning point from me came in 1998 when I attended a conference on neurodevelopmental disorders in Gothenburg, which was arranged by the pioneering Professor Christopher Gilberg. There were 2,700 delegates at that conference, and I thought, we are not alone. But as the conference progressed, my hopes for a dignified and meaningful future for our daughter plummeted with each depressing statistics about exclusion, family breakdowns, isolation, and even suicide. Given the number of delegates, I understood that this is an issue that concerns us all, in all walks of life. And therefore, to me, those depressing statistics were simply unacceptable. We need to focus on what they can do and not on what they can't do. So I gave up my day job as a journalist and I set up Mindrood in 2000 with the vision of making sure that no mind is left behind. And Mindrood is an independent Scottish charity that creates awareness about all kinds of learning difficulties. We support families, we offer practical advice and help to anyone who needs it for as long as they need it and for free. And by learning difficulties, we mean ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, OCD, Tourette syndrome, dyslexia, dyspraxia. I'm sure you've heard of all of them. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if you too have someone in your family that's struggling with any or several of these issues. There are 5 children in every class that have some form of stumbling block. They're not disabled like Annie, but they learn in a different way. And if those 5 children are not supported from the start, they too will become part of those unacceptable statistics. So society seems to have a blind spot, its own form of learning difficulty, if you like, in its inability to meet the needs of anyone who falls out with the norm. To paraphrase Martin Luther King's wonderful "I Have a Dream" speech, it is still the case that people with learning difficulties are lingering in the corners of our society. So how much do we know about the brain and how it works today? Many experts believe we have managed to map out 20% and that we understand perhaps 10 of those 20%. Some experts don't believe we understand 10%. And you might think that's depressing, but I actually think it's very exciting because it means that things can only get much, much, much better. Research is the door to tomorrow. The research that goes on today and the speed with which the scientists can work is simply mind-blowing. What used to take the Human Genome Project over a decade to do can now be done in less than a week. That's incredible. In fact, our own daughter Annie is a very good example of that because in 10 years' time, we went from a diagnosis which was unsatisfactory and actually incorrect, which was brain damage that occurred during pregnancy in 1997, to this. And this means that Annie has a chromosome deletion on chromosome 1, the upper arm. 21 genes are missing out of approximately 21,000 that we all have. The next, Annie, her chromosome deletion is unique, so we decided to call it Annie's syndrome. And the next step in this genetic detective novel of ours will be to try and find out what those 21 genes would have contributed had she arrived intact. However, that technology hasn't caught up with that thought just yet. So here, in the meantime, is a portrait of my daughter, missing genes and all. Those genes may be conspicuously absent in her genome, but the genes that represent a breakneck sense of humor, innocence, generosity, possessiveness, shopaholic tendencies, hoarding instincts, an obsession with soft toys and dolls and wallets and bags, creativity, ingenuity, courage, robust health, and an innate grace. Those genes are certainly not missing. Annie's geneticist, Professor David Fitzpatrick, believes that within the next 2 to 3 years, we will be able to map out all those genes that cause problems. And once we've done that, they can start to compare them and see if there are overlaps. Now, he says, is a very exciting time to be a geneticist. But there are different ways of looking through that microscope, and so they do all over the world. In Lausanne, they have the fantastic Human Brain Project going on. In Gothenburg, they have the Gilbert Center with its global network. In Glasgow, they have Helen Minnis and her team. And here in Edinburgh, we have the Patrick Wild Center, the Muir Maxwell Center, Anne Rowling Center, the Ewan MacDonald Center, and the newly announced Salveson Mindrood Center. And it is their collective findings that will help us families rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation and on to the sunlit path of a dignified future, to paraphrase Martin Luther King again. Think of it like an orchestra, a neurologist told me. We've got most sections sorted. We've got the brass and the strings and the woodwind and the percussion. What we need to do now is bring them all together and find that conductor. On the wall in my study, there sits a badge as a poignant reminder of who I now am, a badge from a parliamentary reception at Scottish Parliament that simply says, Sophie Dow, rare chromosome disorders and Mindrood. Who could have predicted such a deviation in life? However, now that I find myself so deeply involved in the world of the brain and the mind and the consequences of what happens when 21 genes go missing, there's nowhere else I'd rather be. No sports department at any TV station doesn't stand a chance against life with Annie, which is eternally interesting, completely exhausting, and always cutting edge. I will finish now with Emily Dickinson's poem, her amazing understanding of the brain all those years ago, who herself was on the autistic spectrum and who died 128 years ago. And it's her insight that's been my guiding light in my work with Mindrood. And that is not an image of the universe. That is a synaptic galaxy which comes from the brain. And if we keep our microscopes and telescopes firmly focused on these two unexplored frontiers, chances are that we will all be more than just okay in the future. Thank you very much for listening.